So hello everyone and welcome to this webinar. I'm your host for this evening. My name is Dawn Walter and I'm the founder of the Anthropology and Technology Conference, which is taking place online this year on Friday the 9th of October. The conference brings together leading national and international experts from the social sciences and technology to champion responsible AI. And there are three streams this year: health tech, fintech and smart cities. So Simon Roberts was one of our 6 keynotes at the inaugural 2019 conference, which took place last October in Bristol. And Simon is a business anthropologist and partner at Stripe Partners, a strategy and innovation consultancy based in London. And Stripe Partners are proud sponsors of both the 2019 and 2020 conference, and we're really glad to have their support. A bit more about Simon. As a business anthropologist, Simon researches the emerging frontiers of people and technology and trying to land that understanding with impact in complex environments. His career began with a PhD on the satellite TV revolution in mid-1990s India. He started the UK's first dedicated ethnographic research company, Ideas Bazaar, before leading an R&D team at Intel's Digital Health Group. In 2013, Simon co-founded Stripe Partners. Simon writes and speaks widely on anthropology, ethnography, and technology, and his work has been covered by media outlets such as the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, and BBC Radio 4. He has recently written a book called The Power of Not Thinking: How Our Bodies Learn and Why We Should Trust Them. And that's why we're here tonight. At a time where we hear a lot about artificial intelligence, big data and machines, it is an important book about the body, embodied knowledge and how we conceive of intelligence. And a quick note about the book. So it has been published in Down Under in Australia and New Zealand. So thanks to the pandemic, we can't get our sticky hands on it down here until January 2021, but you can get the ebook from Amazon. So before we start, a quick reminder of the agenda. I'll be asking Simon questions for about 30 minutes until about 7:05, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. If you can please post your questions in the chat, and we'll pose as many questions as we have time for to Simon. Right, let's get started. Simon, thank you so much for being with us tonight. I'm really excited to share your book and your thinking with everyone here tonight.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Pleasure. So for people who haven't read the book, why did you write it and what questions did you want to answer?
Why did I write it? I mean, apart from the middle-age desire to discover whether I really did have a book inside me, I guess there are sort of 3 reasons really. You know, the first, as an anthropologist, I've always been interested in, I suppose, what I would call cultural knowledge. So tacit knowledge, knowledge that doesn't get written down, is not explicit in nature, that gets passed around through the socialization process, and guides our existence through the complex everyday. So one first interest, I suppose, is that broad notion of tacit knowledge. So as a second, as a professional reason, which is that over my career, I've become increasingly interested in sort of, I suppose, broadly what works. What is the best way of helping organizations understand the world? But secondly, what's the best way of helping people use that understanding to create impact? And I think over the years, I've become sort of increasingly not suspicious, but increasingly less convinced that explicit knowledge, death by PowerPoint, if you will, is what makes kind of knowledge sticky and tractable, and impactful in organizations. And I suppose at a simple level, I think that, as is described in the book, experience is at the heart of how we understand the world, and therefore giving other people experiences should be part as a consultant of how we help people make sense of the worlds around them. I suppose the third reason, again, is another sort of personal one, I suppose, which is, I suppose, partly because I'm an anthropologist. I'm somewhat suspicious of individualistic, sort of psychological accounts of the world, and often also quite frustrated by kind of neuro accounts of the world. Anytime I see a kind of a phrase along the lines of, we saw this bit of someone's brain light up, I wonder kind of what it really tells us. It seems to me very kind of reductive at some levels. And so, and I think those three things together sort of led me to think more about the role that the body plays, not just in how we experience, but make sense of the world, and therefore, in a sense, are what we like to call intelligence. So yeah, I wanted to explore the body's sort of contribution to that idea of and reality of intelligence.
Great, thank you. So as you explain on the first few pages, a prime example of embodied knowledge is driving, and it's a seemingly simple task that's actually really complex, and it makes us realise the challenges for the makers of autonomous vehicles. So how to replicate that embodied knowledge and intelligence in a driverless vehicle. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, driving, I think, is a really good example because, well, not everybody drives. If you don't drive, think of riding a bike. An example I also use and really like, because I think it captures very a diverse range of aspects of embodied knowledge that I think are important, and which I explore in the book. So one is that embodied knowledge is often, if not always, kind of practical. So it's what sort of Merleau-Ponty talked about as knowledge in the hand. So it's something that allows us to do complex tasks. The second is, I think, driving involves I was going to say intuition. I think instinct is, or instinctive behavior is a better way of putting it, which is linked to sort of, I suppose, another kind of aspect of driving, which I talk a lot about in the book, which is improvisation. So yeah, it's very rare when we drive that the same journey on the same road is ever the same as the last time we made that journey. The world throws lots of unanticipated, unexpected things at us, and we're incredibly good at dealing with that. And perhaps it's something we'll pick up on later, but as I see it, the rule doesn't really conform to rules, and so I think driving throws up the amazing capability we have as a species to kind of deal with environments that don't conform to those sorts of rules, or in where we can't anticipate what's going to happen yet next, and yet we're deeply kind of capable of dealing with it most of the time. I think another thing about driving is that we acquire that knowledge through embodied knowledge of how to drive through repetition, through practice. And it's through that kind of repetition and practice of something that we, our bodies come to, have what someone called sedimented habits. So, that kind of instinctive ability for our hand just to move the gear stick, press on the brake with just the right amount of pressure. We learn the feel of a car, the feel of the road, and most of those things happen through our bodies. So driving for me is kind of great because I think most of us might be able to relate to it, even if we've only ever been a passenger. And secondly, it's obviously a kind of an area of massive technological investment and effort, and no small amount of kind of overclaim as to what's possible, and a sort of sector of R&D where I think expectations as to what would be possible were, as is often the case, set rather nearer in the future than is actually turning out to be feasible. So I think for those reasons, it's a good way of highlighting what we're able to do, but which is quite difficult to replicate through autonomous systems.
Thanks, Simon. Can you take us quickly through the 5 features of embodied knowledge? I won't go through them all. In other words, how embodied knowledge is acquired, because it forms quite an integral part of your book.
Yeah, I can do. So yeah, I think one of the challenges, if I can start by saying, one of the challenges in writing the book in the first place is that, as I said almost at the outset, embodied knowledge is in many ways, or nearly always, tacit knowledge. So it's not something that's very easy for us to verbalize. So there's no small kind of irony in trying to write a book about something that's difficult to articulate. So one of the jobs that my editor brilliantly did with me at the beginning was really force me to sort of disentangle kind of different aspects of embodied knowledge. And I don't think the 5 things that I've organized the second part of the book around are necessarily kind of MECE. For those that don't know, kind of that means mutually exclusive or collectively exhaustive. But they, I think, are all important. So to take them in order very, very quickly, the first is a point about observation, which is really a chapter about how we learn, both through kind of bodily engagement, immersion in the world, but in more sophisticated ways, how the science is showing, and anthropology indeed demonstrates, particularly some really interesting kind of transdisciplinary kind of anthropologists. One in particular called Trevor Marchand, have shown really well how we build knowledge from the body out, as it were, and are able actually to learn through imitation, to learn through mere observation, indeed, of what other people are doing. So that there's the first piece there, which is about acquisition through observation. The second is about kind of practice, and I touched on this in relation to cars, but it's about the sort of repeated performance of skills. And in that chapter, I talk a little bit about Hubert Dreyfus's model of kind of expertise acquisition, from kind of being a novice in something to being expert in it. And one of the fundamental points that he makes is one around knowledge moving from sort of theoretical, as it were, to practical, from kind of linguistic to non-linguistic. In other words, we stop having to think about what we're doing as we become expert in things. To take another one out of turn, perhaps, is no, I won't. I'll do them in turn. So the third is really about improvisation, which again, this fundamental point for me in the book, which is about how little the world conforms, as it were, to rules, how unpredictable the world is, and how integral the body is to acts of sensory perception, planning, prediction, pattern recognition, and so forth. So many of those things kind of come from the body, and allow us to sort of to deal with the unfamiliar, with the unknown. The fourth is a piece about empathy. I'm not sure I particularly agree with my editor on naming that chapter as such, but and it's one of the chapters that's very kind of neuro, actually, in a way, because I've become I both sort of learned to see that mirror neurons, which are bits of the brain, play a role in helping us understand other people. So a lot of the knowledge we acquire of how other people are feeling, maybe even what they're thinking, and certainly what they may be experiencing, come through our observation of them, and through the triggering in our brains of neurons that are comparable with or in fact are the same neurons that are triggered when we actually perform a task. So we see somebody perform something, and bits of our brain trigger, the same bits of our brain trigger as if we were performing that action themselves. So when you see somebody grimacing, you kind of know why they're grimacing, and your body is, in a sense, at a kind of almost a cellular level, grimacing too. And then the final one is really about sort of storage, retention, and recall of embodied knowledge. So we're probably all familiar with Proust's kind of Madeleine, that sort of dipping a biscuit in a cup of tea and kind of being taken back to another part of your childhood. The body is absolutely central to how we remember things, how we recall experiences, our memories, and many other such things. So it's a chapter and a kind of an account really of how embodied knowledge kind of gets laid down in our bodies in often quite physical ways, and also how we are able to well, I've been thinking a lot about it in the context of COVID, but you know, how crowds work, you know, how bodies move in sympathy with each other, how clapping operates, how we understand the non-verbal aspects of what people are communicating, are all, as I argue, kind of located in the body.
Great, thanks, Simon. So one of the most important points that you make in your book is that our bodies are critical to the formulation and retention of intelligence, that the body is not simply a device to carry our brains around, but our brains are not isolated entities like computers, and that the field of robotics has made its advances because it left behind the idea of disembodied cognition. Can you speak to that with reference to your conversations with roboticists Alan Winfield and Mark Woods?
Yeah, I think Mark Woods is
I
on the
know, I
call,
can
so I
see.
better be careful that I get his stuff right, with experts. Yeah, so I mean, you know, I think perhaps it's kind of evident by kind of what I've already said. You know, I view intelligence as having kind of significant kind of bodily components, and I'd go, you know, I'd go further, and I think Alan Winfield was kind of really clear in a sense that I should go further and I should be more adamant about the idea that, that kind of intelligence requires kind of embodiment, and of course, you know, it's pretty late on in the book, but then of course I need to answer the question, well, what do I mean by intelligence? And I pick a couple of kind of nice definitions. So one from a brilliant roboticist called Rodney Brooks, whose blog is and writings are just inspiring. And he talks about intelligence as the sort of stuff that humans do pretty much all of the time. And Alan Winfield has a sort of, I suppose, a similar perspective, and talks about, you know, the ability of an entity to kind of learn and adapt and respond to its environment. So again, taking us back to this driving example. What I think interested me in researching the book was that I saw, and perhaps, you know, it's not a massive discovery, but I hadn't sort of seen the link between the development of AI as a discipline and the link and robotics. And what seemed to me to be happening in a certain period of time was the two fields kind of converging on a central realization or insight, which simply put is that you are unlikely to build good AI or indeed good robots if you rely on this kind of rule-based approach to either. For a simple reason that, as I've said repeatedly, to the extent that the world does kind of run on rules, as it were, to load those into any device or entity or system would be almost a task of kind of without end, right? So, and certainly, you know, in the early days, taxed the computers that roboticists were using to the extent that, you know, they had to look sort of elsewhere. And Rodney Brooks, I think, was, in my mind, but I may be wrong, and Mark Woods could correct me, was a roboticist who kind of who became very interested in insects, and you know, perhaps we typically regard them as having kind of not many neurons. I think a cockroach has got 1 million neurons, right? We've got 100 billion or something as humans. But he made the sort of, I suppose, made the leap to say, well, what if the kind of the body is the thing that actually is drive? You know, we typically think of it as a lower form of intelligence than what's above our shoulders. But his, I think, really profound insight was that actually, you know, it may well be that the body is the thing that's providing, you know, as it were, the ability to make sense of an environment. And once you start to kind of build out the sensory capabilities of a body in a robot, you then get to a place where you're no longer reliant in the same sorts of way of building kind of rules into a system. And so that for me is where there's this lovely crossover that starts to emerge between kind of AI and robotics, because, in a sense, the big leap forwards in the fields of AI have been, to move beyond rules, but also beyond a kind of an exercise in constructing kind of symbolic representations of the world around them, and rather to build capabilities that allow them to adaptively learn what's going on in the world. So I hope that kind of explanation makes some sort of sense. But the significant thing for me is that these two disciplines seem to have alighted on the same notion of embodiment as the thing that intelligence has embodied, that has propelled them forward.
And you write that a focus on the body, as you've just sort of said, can help us see the potential limits to AI and why it might be legitimate to think of the absence of embodiment as a single constraining factor in its development. Can you talk to that with reference to language, particularly in conversation and AI, which you do touch on in your book?
Yeah. I mean, that's a sort of book in its own right, isn't it? But yeah, I think when you think about kind of language, you quickly discover, and I think this is, well regarded as a universal. I talk about the work of Lakoff and Johnson, and a book called Metaphors We Live By, which was, an attempt to sort of understand, patterns of language, and particularly, as the title suggests, the sort of metaphors that people speaking different languages around the world use. And I think that the kind of profound discovery they made was that language both reflects, but also perhaps at sort of deep structural levels, depends on the kind of embodied nature of experience. So they have lots and lots of examples of, the different ways in which the way that we talk about relationships, about experiences, we talk about cordial relations between people being warm, or kind of relations of enmity being cold. Hierarchy is expressed in very spatial ways. Relationships are expressed in terms of distance and so forth too. So, in a sense, the argument I'm making is that without the ability to understand the world, it's very difficult to reproduce, systems that can satisfactorily, as it were, engage with us in conversation, because you can learn the rules of a language, but to really understand what's going on when people use language, you need to understand the world too. So, and again, you sort of see that insight rippling through into the ways in which approaches to both conversational UI, but also things like translation, have shifted from a kind of statistical approach. So in the early days, you took the corpus of UN transcripts, beautifully translated by humans into multiple languages. You fed all those into a machine, and hey presto, you've got translation. But of course, it didn't really work. So now actually the approach that's used is a more probabilistic one, more kind of neural net-like, and it's by kind of learning through trial and error, learning through adaptation, by and improvisation, that language, if you will, can the challenges of conversational UI or of translation are being surmounted. And yet, I suppose, tantalizingly, the Turing test, that Alan Turing kind of laid out, also known as the sort of, the imitation game, is kind of testament to the fact that we are still a long way away from building, a conversational AI that can that can fool a human. So I think language, yes, embodied, depends on understanding of the world, but the developments that have been achieved in that field, and there are, of course, many, all rely, to my mind, on notions broadly compatible with this idea of embodiment and learning through experience.
In our interview with you last year, you said, and I love this, I think our body is our superpower. It's our source of competitive advantage in the next phase of technological development. And your last chapter speaks to that hope too, that human intelligence is something quite special and not to be overlooked or taken for granted in this age of AI and big data. And can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, if there was another reason why you might write a book like this at this point in time, is that we've lived through this kind of big data is going to sort of eat everything and take all our jobs, and I think we're now, and that's turned out sort of, I think, broadly speaking, not quite to be the case. I think we're now sitting at a point in time where, of course, AI, machine learning has made tremendous advances that appears to me to be speeding up almost with every month. And so I think, we are likely to kind of, I suppose, as a species, feel a bit of despair, right? That the robots are coming for our lunch, and so I didn't really want to write a book that was sort of like, no, that's not going to happen. And this, on the other hand, I think I could have been clearer, or even more, should we say, controversial in saying, machine intelligence, artificial intelligence will never achieve, kind of the sort of general intelligence that we possess. But I suppose perhaps I'm a more nuanced person. Sometimes I'm more nuanced, not often. But I think I'm interested in the relationship and the way that, as it were, our kind of the matrimony between machines and humans has developed over history, and I see that relationship as being one, more accurately defined as kind of co-working, if that makes sense. So I think it's about recognizing what's distinctive about our capabilities, both, as it were, kind of cognitive and practical, and then, as it were, kind of marking our territory, defining, our respective roles, identifying areas where artificially intelligent systems can support us, and then identifying the places where, either for kind of practical reasons, or for shall we say, more spiritual or identity-based reasons, we might want to let humans get on with it. And we did some work with Google G Suite a couple of years back, and we identified very clear lines that knowledge workers had between what they saw as kind of core tasks and peripheral tasks. I think this is a really good example of where you can say to AI, look, great, book those meetings for me, or do some of this kind of nonsense work that kind of most of our working lives involves kind of large amounts of, but let me focus on the stuff that's central to my identity, but also the stuff where I'm bringing something distinctive to the party. So I suppose overall, what I hope the book achieves is to kind of restore a little bit more confidence, as it were, in us, but also to suggest that almost the way to achieve that confidence is to sort of seed territory where it makes sense to seed territory to kind of artificial intelligence or robots, whichever you want to pick on. And so, yeah, so hopefully, a little bit more nuanced, but also something that can, give us a bit of hope. We all need a bit of hope.
We certainly do. So we've seen how important embodied knowledge is and how relevant it is to artificial intelligence and robotics. So for the anthropologists among us tonight, how do you see anthropologists and other social scientists contributing to this space?
Well, perhaps partly in the ways I've just outlined, actually, which I think kind of, close engagement with technologists and engineers in the design and definition of these kinds of systems, I think is really critical. So, I'd like to think that if we hadn't done this work with G Suite, there'd be a whole bunch of things that it would try to do for you that would feel like they were impinging on your identity as a knowledge worker, rather than actually clearing the way to let you get on with the stuff, that brings you a modicum of satisfaction and sense of purpose and contribution to an organization. So I think, in large part, this is about kind of robust engagement, and it's about kind of deep, thoughtful research, and I think it's also about, in a sense, about sort of the politics of this as well, which is, recognizing, that absent kind of thoughtful, critical research, I think there's a tendency, and this isn't a sort of broad brush criticism of engineers, it certainly isn't meant to be, but I think absent kind of deep, thoughtful, critical work, sometimes engineering, as it were, as a discipline can get somewhat ahead of itself. So this is about, I think, doing work that can focus on what's important to people, that doesn't reproduce existing sociocultural and other biases, and not being a sort of handbrake, but being, more of a steering wheel, if you will, to end with a kind of another driving analogy. I don't think this is about putting the brake on, but this is about kind of helping set the right sort of direction at many different levels.
Great, thank you, Simon. Everyone's been very shy tonight, and I can't see any questions in the chat, so there must be some questions. Come on, I want Mark to come out from the shadows and ask some questions. If not, Simon, the floor is yours, and you can keep. Oh, here we go. There's somebody.
Tell us about how you wrote the book. So the questions tell us how you wrote the book. I mainly wrote it on the 6:40 train from Battle in East Sussex to London, so it was written in just about 1 hour segments, and on planes, and with a quick with a sort of solid burst. Did I interview experts? That's the sort of silly answer. I didn't, unfortunately, have sort of 6 months off. I had to run a business and take my kids to sports and things like that. I did interview experts, either in kind of in short instances or in kind of longer engagements. Many of the examples I use in the book are things that we've done at Stripe Partners, my business. So many of the examples are things that I've done myself and have actually been critical to the kind of the development of my interest in this space. So particularly a kind of a camping trip with some executives from Duracell and things like that. And then I talk also in the book about a 24-hour simulation of the experience of being a refugee that I went to Hong Kong to participate in. So yeah, there's a mixture of kind of practical engagement and of interviewing and sort of trying to do the best job I could of not bastardizing, a great many very clever people's work, that they've spent a lifetime doing. I think the real challenge with a book like this is, I have written it, I was asked to write it as a very accessible thing. The goal I set myself was something that, you could read in bed and not fall asleep reading. Whether that turns out to have been successfully achieved, I don't know, but I've tried to make it accessible, and I think that was the thing that I found really hard, because it's easy to sort of slip back into academic obfuscation. So I hope that answers that question. It was fun, actually. I really enjoyed it. It's such a sort of amazing challenge to try and write a book at any stage in your life or career, I think. But to do it amongst everything else that's going on is particularly hard.
Yeah, well done, Simon. So we've got some more questions. Do you want me to read them to you, or do you want to read them and then?
Oh, I could see them. Yeah. What would be your advice to ethnographers who'd like to incorporate embodied knowledge in their research practice? That's a great question. I think there's two or three things that you could say. I mean, I think the first one is, as an industry of kind of research, product research, market research, whatever you want to call it. I think we've slipped over the years, partly because of the legacy of that field and kind of market research and psychological kind of approaches. We've slipped into thinking that the interview is kind of essentially the core of a research encounter. It's obviously really important, but I think for me the really important thing to do as a researcher is to remember that you and your body are a central device for understanding the world, and so you both need to construct experiences that will take you closer to the world that you want to understand. Also to construct experiences that give you kind of slightly orthogonal, as it were, oblique kind of angles on those worlds. And for me, it's about persuading your clients to come with you, because fundamental to me is the idea that trying to communicate knowledge in explicit forms has many, many, many limitations, and experiences that you undertake, for many of the reasons I outline in the book, come to reside in your body. And so what we found through our professional practice at Stripe Partners is that by taking clients with us, much of the job of kind of turning, experiences into explicit knowledge on a PowerPoint chart doesn't need to be done, although we do that too. So I think it's about thinking beyond the interview and think about the ways in which you can really embody the worlds that you want to understand. Makes research an awful lot more fun than just asking people questions from a script for a couple of hours.
So we've got a question from Hannah.
Do you think that this global experiment in remote work can teach us about embodied experiences? Hell yeah. So, God, where do you start with that? I mean, fundamentally, of course, the ability for us to do things like this now is brilliant. It's amazing. And, we can gather people from around the world and chat and communicate. However, I think we are all keenly aware that there are many, many limitations to the virtual. And I'm struck by how that shows up, of course, in the conditions of work. And I think there's some really interesting commentary around about, what everyone's missing about offices. I'm particularly interested in what we miss in terms of how we learn. So central to my sort of thesis is the idea we learn through observation and through mimesis, through imitation. So I'm interested in kind of some of the challenges in a remote work setting, particularly how kind of younger, early stage people in a career can learn from others around them in an environment in which, the only real means of communication are through video or, asynchronous working on a document or chat windows. So I think there's all of that, and I also think that bodies, when they come together, resonate. They resonate in quite fundamental, physical, biological ways. You know, the whole notion of entrainment, you know, pendulum swinging together, you know, organ pipes that start to play the same note. Humans do that too. Everything in almost in the biological world entrains with each other. And I think one of the things that's deeply missing from this great global remote work experiment is it, as it were, the social contagion of mood, that's so central to not only senses of our sense of purpose, our sense of, you know, camaraderie. It's also central to how we understand others and what they're going through and what they're feeling. So I think there's plenty in this book, but of course the broader field of kind of embodiment that that can help us understand what it is we're missing and why we're missing it.
Yeah, I've started kind of changing it around. People say doing virtual meetings is draining on the energy, and I've kind of started shifting that. It's more like you're not getting the energy from being in the room with these other bodies.
Yeah. There's a guy, I can't pronounce his name. He's at INSEAD, and he's written some lovely stuff about this. I think he's a psychotherapist as well as teaching in a business, and he talks about the absence of presence as well as the presence of absence. Absence of presence, the presence of absence is what he talks about. And I think it's there is just so much in, you know, in nonverbal kind of communication that we miss, which is so vital to mood. So I think good examples are kind of, you know, what is a football match or a cricket match without a crowd? You know, it's interesting that Radio 4 or Test Match Special are playing kind of background crowd noise, as it were. You know, Boris Johnson, whatever else you think of him, you know, is pretty useless without kind of loads of people braying behind him, right? That in the absence of that kind of that mood music, that very physical kind of social contagion, a lot of everyday things just are absolutely stripped of their kind of their meaning, their momentum, and their energy. So so yeah, for me, I put a lot of that down to the body. There's a question from Cecile. If experience is at the heart of how we understand the world, how is being surrounded by autonomous systems, etc., going to shape us as a society in return? God, that's a good question. Well, I suppose one of the things that interests me about kind of, I suppose, autonomous systems, so, you know, maybe it's kind of you know, maybe it's the sort of algorithms that show us what they show us online, or you know, mapping software that kind of guides us through a city. I think a good way of thinking about, kind of a Marshall McLuhan-esque way of thinking about technology is as environments, and I think it's often quite difficult for us to discern, as it were, kind of, if you will, what happens. Well, you know, the system and the world sort of almost merge, right? And then we're in this environment, as Marshall McLuhan said, you know, fish don't know of the existence of water until they're beached. So it's quite difficult for us to sort of, as it were, at a experiential level, to disentangle kind of, you know, what are the ways in which those invisible forces are shaping us. So I think, I don't know if I have the you know, the simple answer to that very very interesting question. Perhaps first we need to sort of try to disentangle the two things, and sort of hold them apart, if you will, before we can kind of understand how they may be shaping our experience. Not a very good answer. That's a good question.
Okay, so
Shinyi, hi Dawn. AI and automation making us humans more robot-like in many ways, generating passive embodied experience. How can we co-work with these fast developing tech to create positive embodied experience and avoid passivity? I suppose the answer to that question for me, in a word, might be friction, you know, and I think so much design work seems to be focused on removing friction from our experiences of the world. Yeah, I think if you look at kind of the classic kind of narratives of smart cities, they're all about kind of people gliding between, home and work which is probably relevant for now, without barely touching a surface, right? You can just sort of get into a taxi that sort of already knows where you're going. And I think one of the things for me is we need to think kind of artfully and playfully and creatively about how we can design sort of positive friction back into the world. I think, it's such a fascination of technologists to kind of remove friction, but I think historically friction has been at the heart of the kind of, the sort of urban swirl, if you will, that makes, for example, cities, productive places where serendipitous encounters happen, ideas get exchanged and built, and amazing things happen. So for me, I think in a word, it's about sort of trying to design the right sorts of friction back into these systems. Morris, is that the Morris that I work with at Intel? That would be lovely if it is. How do you convince executives in joining embodied research? What reactions did you receive? Yeah, it's not always been easy over the years. Certainly taking 10, 12 execs from Duracell camping and a very cold national park near San Diego was probably the biggest professional risk of my life. And it could have gone horribly wrong, especially when one of the participants turned out to be a weed smoker with a gun. But we survived, and they were convinced by it. So they wanted to do it again, and so we did it again. We didn't go camping next time. But I think partly, the way that we've convinced people over the years to do it has been about saying, look, the gravitational pull of most organizations is back in on themselves, right? And the higher you go up an organization, the more time you spend thinking about the organization and the politics and the reorgs and the budgets and the structures and many things which are of no relevance to your customers whatsoever. And so in many ways, I think it's about making the case for kind of, engaging with the world and seeing it for yourself through their eyes and bodies, rather than relying on a presentation from us. And it's also, I think, the case that we've made to people is, a week may feel like a long time to join us and go away and do something. But the momentum that you can build as a team, often we work with product teams in technology companies, the momentum you can build off a week together as a team is really incredible. Actually, it's profound, and it lasts a very long time. Back to this point about retention, so you can remember experiences you had, moments of conversation, moments of realization about what mattered in ways that are very sustaining. You don't have to go back to page 39 of a PowerPoint chart to look up the quote or, the story or whatever. You were there, you heard it, the penny dropped, and, you could hear that penny drop while you were there. So, so I think, it's not been easy, but I think once you've done it, word tends to spread in organizations. That's certainly been our experience.
So it is Morris. He said yes. He's been very shy.
Cool.
So that's nice. There's a question after all. There's a question from Mark after all my links.
Yeah. Can AI still be seen as technology tool and so stay an extension of the human body, or will AI discover a different, broader embodiment than the human body and so finally detach from us humans? Figuring out whether I quite get, that's a sort of a good example of, if you'd said that, I might have a better grasp of what you're driving at.
Mark, do you want to
I try to. I try to.
Do.
I'm a designer originally, so I really live based on these tools, an extension of our body.
Yeah.
And yeah, I find it just very interesting. So what you said about the embodiment, how important it is, and I wonder if AI experienced this, if it has any reason to stay on the embodiment that we taught it, or because it can have embodiment of an insect suddenly or something.
Yeah.
How would that end, or should we allow it?
Yeah, so I mean, if your question's one about kind of, I suppose, the material form that AI can take, I mean, I think you know, in a sense, kind of, you know, for me, kind of at least one definition of a robot, at least nowadays, is that it's got, you know, some form of AI, machine learning in it, as it were, running it. I think the challenge that we confront goes back to the one about sort of systems, as it were, that we kind of live in, but are very difficult for us to discern, if you will, the edges of kind of what's kind of artificially intelligent and what's not. And so I think that's perhaps one of the sources of the unease that we have, right? Because we are surrounded by systems that are, yeah, at some levels they're, you know, they're physically manifest. It's a train system, or, you know, it's a taxi service, or you know, it's a shopping experience. And yet what's difficult for us to do is sort of disentangle kind of, like, why are we seeing that advert there? Like, what's going, you know, is there something that knows that it's me, and this is my, you know, these are my habits, this is my mode of kind of, you know, the habitual kind of mobility patterns that I exhibit, and this advert's being served to me. I think one of the sources of unease is the fact it's quite difficult for us to sort of disentangle that stuff. So you know, to the kind of Mark Viner point, you know, of computing kind of disappearing out into the background, I think we're already in that situation, and it would probably bring us some comfort if we could always point at the AI, if you will, and say it's in there. I think that's sort of, for me, somewhat the comforting thing with something like an Alexa. You can kind of point at it and say, that's kind of smart, that's got AI in it. Of course, what actually sits behind that is, you know, huge warehouses running racks of servers, and, you know, at some level, yeah, AI is both very material and also very immaterial. And then yet again, because it sits, you know, in physical embodied ways in a warehouse, it's material again. So I think it's difficult for us at this stage as sort of, at least at a general population level, to kind of make sense of where one thing ends and the other thing begins. And but I don't believe in transhumanism, which is the detachment of, as it were, of intelligence, the ability for us to detach our intelligence from our bodies, which is perhaps not what you were asking, but is implied in there somewhere.
Yeah, I do think that. There's a question from Karina. Karina, do you want to ask, or should we just read it out? She might be on us.
Karina.
Hello.
Yay.
Yeah, maybe read it out, because I'm on my phone and I can't.
Yeah, sure.
To go back to
I'm
my
curious
tab.
on why you chose the form of a book to sense make around the topic of embodied language, and if you're exploring also other more embodied forms of expression. Well, I talked to that from the outset, right, in the sense of you know, the sort of the irony of trying to write about a form of knowledge that is inchoate is almost impossible to articulate. Yes, I think if I was a slightly more creative person, I might have thought of different ways of expressing it. You know, I think there's a consultancy called Red Associates who made some beautiful films over the years on their website about things like truffle hunters and winemakers. And, you know, for me, those are, you know, I don't need to go and make those films because they've done it really beautifully. And I think they're talking about many of the same issues, right? Which is, you know, which is about expertise. It's about kind of the sort of knowledge that is in the nose of a winemaker, or in the you know, the repeated kind of artistic practice, as it were, of a craftsman. So in many ways, if I was going to make a film about this, I'd actually kind of in a way default to kind of, you know, to some kind of, you know, practical kind of everyday activity, whether it's something like car driving or something slightly more, you know, sophisticated, if you will, like, you know, woodwork or fine furniture making. But no, it's a good question. You know, I'm sort of boring and middle-aged, and so I wanted to write a book. So I need to unleash my creative side. Question from Mark Woods. One simple question: what is the direction of travel for our relationship with our bodies? Are we becoming more removed or closer? What role does tech play in this? That's a great question. So I'm bound to say this, I suppose, but I feel like there is an increasing kind of turn to the body, both in, you know, in a range of different areas. So one of the things I say in the book is that what fascinated me as I dug into this space was how kind of cognitive science, roboticists, artificial intelligence engineers, anthropologists, philosophers, neuropsychologists, neuroscientists are all kind of hitching their wagon, as it were, to this idea of the body. But I think if you look further afield, I think, yeah, there's plenty of evidence, sort of lots of interesting gut science, and, you know, how our bodies make sense of our emotions, or indeed our emotions come from the body, and our bodies make sense of the world and of how we feel and communicate it to us. So I think there are a whole host of different kind of areas, from kind of high science to kind of, you know, almost Daily Mail kind of level commentary about the body that are very much out there. You know, having written a book like this, I suppose, and also I think the last few months have shown us what I would sort of call the limits of the virtual world, right? I think, you know, this has reminded us, if nothing else was ever going to remind us, that whilst all of these tools are brilliant, there is just, you know, I think Hubert Dreyfus put it beautifully, kind of like what's a telehug? You know, there is something about a cuddle, a hug, that is just out there, right? That you will never ever, with all the best, you know, technology and haptic controllers and everything else you can throw at it, you know, just that feeling of whatever you get, that whole continuum of emotions when you have a hug with somebody. We've realized that over the last few months, and I hope we hold on to that, because you know, it's fundamentally central to our kind of meaningful existence.
Oh, thank you.
Everything's got a COVID angle nowadays.
Yeah, isn't it? So we have come to the end. Does anybody have one final question? If not, I will.
No. Well,
we've got 1 minute left. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you everybody for all your questions, and thank you so much to Simon for taking time out to come to talk to us tonight about your book. So I've posted some links in the chat, and this has been recorded, so it will be posted online, and I will send the link out to everybody so you can watch it again later, because there's lots of good stuff in here. So thank you all very much.
Well, thank you all for turning up virtually, and I hope to see you viscerally soon.
Fantastic. Can't wait to get my
physical copy.
Thank you.
All right.
Guys.
Take care. Thanks for having me.